Was welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Val, and thanks very much to the Society for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's part of an ongoing project that we've had for some time, not just me and my wife, but the other members of the expedition. One time we were 6, and sadly we're now down to 3. We have, very luckily, in the audience, we have Sally Howell and Gwen Tutt. But I'll tell you a bit about the story of the thing. But the most important part of the project I have at the moment is to gather all the material we've had from the expedition, from our 6, and put it together, digitize it, and pass it through to the University Special Collections, which is in your library. The idea being that our expedition took us to 2 parts of the world which were in a time of change, and our expedition academics were looking at those changes, and we've recorded them, both on paper and on sound, which has been hard to find, and film and straightforward photography, and a few memories, but I'm afraid those are, for me, are rather fading now. So I'm relying very much on the written word. So let's move on, and we'll go through, you know who I am. The other 6 you'll soon learn about. And we'll begin at the beginning, and this is a story. I've got a long way to go, hopefully 45 minutes around the world. We were 6. We had me as a photographer, we had an economist who was the business manager, we had a geographer who became the project's leader, we had a drama student as the writer, we had another geographer who became a sound recordist with BBC, and he was the engineer. He looked after the 2 cars that we had. Anyway, that's the outline of the thing. The patron was the Lord Mayor of Bristol. He's not here tonight. The Vice-Chancellor was in charge of our money, and in those days we were a smaller university. We were only 3,000 students. We knew more or less each one of us, and now I gather you're nearly 22,000. So times were totally different, and we're talking of really 57 years ago, although the story is actually going to start 60 years ago. Well, here is the team. Let's go for it.
The members of the expedition were Peter Crinks, geographer and projects leader, Mark Howell, mechanic, in daily maintenance of the cars. Mark also made the tape recordings. Malcolm McKernan, writer, trying to keep up to date with the log. Roger Tutt, our economist, here on duty cooking breakfast. While Donald Pilton, doctor and cook, prepares sandwiches for the day's drive. And Tony Morrison prepares his cameras. He used a minimum of 4 at a time, sometimes 5. Everyone had a definite job to do, but often had to help with somebody else's department, whether skilled in it or not. That's the way an expedition works.
Right, well, I've been thrown slightly. That should have come a bit later, but don't worry too much. I think I can cope. The start of the idea came from a Bristolian, Mark Howell. Now, Mark was a Bristolian through and through, but he was a bit of a wild card. His brother, who was a PhD, or is a PhD, academic, said Mark was a wayward character. But Mark was fearless, he was very inventive, and he was very enthusiastic. And he didn't actually take stupidity very kindly. So in 1957, with his girlfriend, he decided to attack the tower which is above us now. I'm not going to explain how he got in, but he created his own secret society, which he called Cabal. And during RAG 1957, he got into the tower with his girlfriend, climbed up, and he stopped. Can you imagine it? That was for rag. I mean, these days they just kind of shove him inside and throw away the key. But anyway, he carried on studying geography, and we got together in the following year. We had an ongoing feud between Bristol and Birmingham at that time. And Mark, not with me, but with another zoologist, decided to attack the University of Birmingham Students' Union. And so driving up there in his rather old Standard 9, they parked outside the Union. The other guy jumped in, ripped a painting off the wall, which was the University Union's founder, grabbed it and brought it back to Bristol. Sorry, you're not... Right, okay. This is Cabal 2, beginning. Right, okay, we had a great rave, as you can imagine. I was told by Meg to tell you something about student life. So we had a procession, a rag procession, down here in front of Brown's, which we'll hear about in a moment, down in front of the University Tower, in Mark's car, carrying this painting. By the way, if you can see it, I'm leaning out the window saying nuts to Birmingham. Right, okay, so we moved on, but Mark was actually very inventive. And using his same technique, he got into the University Tower with a gang, also of Cabal, who are committed to complete secrecy, as you might imagine. Some of them are very secret because they're not here these days. But they climbed to the top, and using his, in those days, army socks filled with sand, they used that to balance a banner across the front of the tower. And it stayed there for the whole of the rag procession. Got lots of headlines. Okay. Right, well, fair enough. You can't do stunts and you of that kind and live that kind of life without academic studies kind of going a bit, well, you know, you can't really do too much studying. And so we gathered in the refectory, which is now Brown's. Now, the refectory was our eating place, drinking place for coffee and tea, and it stank of greens and brown soupy, what you would call it, gravy. And we would meet there between lectures, and the zoologists from in the Department of Zoology and the geographers from the Department of Geography, as they were called in those days, we used to meet there, but on separate tables. But we talked, and we said, what are we going to do when we fail? I mean, failing was a serious possibility. And you have to remember, in those days, we were not being paid for by ourselves, we were being paid for by the county we came from, some form of grant. And if you failed, or if you failed a certain step in your exams, your grant was cut back. And that was a serious matter. You know, you were penalized. So one person said to Mark, how about using your car to go to India? Let's drive to India. And in 1955, a group of Cambridge graduates had taken Land Rovers to India. And they'd made a book and a film. And it was impossible. I mean, it was not the hippie trail of the late 60s. This was early stuff, when really and truly it was kind of a wild journey. So we said, okay, done. I went back to work because I passed my exams. But university life for me continued, and I was, amongst other things, very much involved with the Reunions Society. This is a clip from Reunions.
Join us, we feel more right. Join us, join us tonight. We'd like to entertain you just for a while. We'd like to raise along a radiant light. Sit tight, we're hoping that you'll all think right. We're nothing else to hold. We just a little training and we're hoping you'll find. We're gonna let our head out and see what we find. We'd like very much to please you all. We hope we don't have to appease you all. The script has been written, rehearsals are done. It's too late to go now, the show begun. Join us, we're glad you came. Join us, who might want to say. Let's start in with the show now. Let's have a breeze and blow now. It's rainy November, but we don't mind. We've left the winter behind.
And from reunions, as well as getting a lot of photographs and a lot of friends, came Peter Crinks, our geographer. I was in the education department getting a Cert Ed, and I was up at the Royal Fort, which is out the back there somewhere these days. And I was very lucky to be in the tutorial group with the Professor Wilson. And we had an absolutely marvellous time. What a way to learn. You sit around in the garden and you chat. But behind the scenes, I was very lucky because visual aids in education, film and television and newspapers and magazines, they were just really starting to take off. And the Department of Education had a 16mm camera, a Bolex, which was made in Switzerland and driven by clockwork. Amazing thing, about this size, weighed about 3 kilos. And I got handy with it, and many weekends I kind of logged it out to me and I would start making bits of film. Photography took over. I forgot about the academic stuff. We had here a European Universities exhibition, which Bristol had won the previous year. I organised the show here. But photography and filmmaking suddenly became my way of life. One weekend, I was out in the Cotswolds, and this was a big turning point, because I was with Mark's old girlfriend, and frankly, honestly, we were just taking pictures in a beechwood. You better believe it, because my wife is sitting down here with me. And I was busy on ecology, because ecology at that time was a growing science. And the interaction or interliving of different plants and animals and so on, and I was interested in the fungi, not for sniffing them, but for taking pictures of them. And I was there crouching on the ground with a little camera, and I think they call them a ghillie, but one of these kind of serfs of the landed gentry came up and said, "Excuse me, sir, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm taking photographs." He said, "Well, you know, this is private land. The footpath is down there, and you're a bit away from the footpath. And in those days, you didn't have this right to roam arrangement. All you could do was keep to the footpath, or could be accused of trespassing." So he said, "Would you, when you finish taking pictures, no hurry, come down and see Sir Foster. He'd like to speak with you." So I thought, oh Christ, I'm in the mire. Here we go. End of a good career. So I went down. There was this old gent sitting on a shooting stick. You can see him there, and his Land Rover was covered with pheasants. That was the whole business of the thing. He'd be talking and go bang, and another bird would fall out of the sky. And he said, "What are you doing?" So I explained very quickly what I was doing, and he was obviously fascinated, because this kind of thing had not hit the storyboard by that time. So, okay. He said, "Go back and take as many pictures as you like, and if you ever want any help with any project, you must come and see me." So, once more, Mark Howell. Mark lived in Sea Mills, halfway to Avonmouth, in fairly modest means with his parents. And he had given up working with the BBC, which was his choice immediately after graduation, and had decided to take a job with the local TV company. But he also hankered after this idea of going to India. And he'd amassed a great pile of papers and letters and maps and all kinds of things. And he had this in the front room of his parents' home, and he had been in touch with what was then the Austin Motor Company. And the Austin Motor Company decided to give him and his outfit one jeep or one Austrian gypsy with all support for, well, they didn't want him to go to India, they wanted him to take it around the world. And of course that was going to be expensive. Hint, hint, Sir Foster might come in. But anyway, back here at kind of university level, I was very much involved with the university union in those days, and we produced a newsletter written by Mark, which was the first newsletter for the proposed expedition. And it was shown around the editorial office of what was then Non-Such News. These days you call it Epigram or something like that. But Non-Such News had a really superb editor, Mike Gorman. He went on to become a 5-star journalist, made a lot of money, made lots of contributions to worthy funds, but he was a brilliant journalist. I think he ended up his life in style in Britain, but he spent a lot of his time in Asia. He gave us a front cover, and you have the front cover, and he also gave us a big spread on the, it's on the front cover here that there's an announcement of a new society to be created called the Expedition Society. But on the inside we got a further spread. And very soon we had a society. The first meeting, it was me, Mark, a guy called Malcolm McKernan, who was the writer for Non-Such. And out of the, behind the scenes, we knew Peter Crinks, but out of the behind the scenes came Roger Tutt, the economist, and a doctor, Don Pilton. Malcolm was very keen in the drama department, so we had things like The Crucible going, a very political program by story by Arthur Miller. But on the fun side, we had a polio victim who had polio since childhood, Bob Giddings. Now, Bob went on to become a great media professor and also writer for numerous newspapers, including The Guardian and other, what you might call trendy newspapers. I don't know what you might call them today. But he did very well. And he set up a spoof German band. Now, if you can read that fast, I don't want to know. And I have a recording of it. This appeared at all reviews, hall and events. But along came a problem. The university got wind of what we were doing. I'd obviously got Sir Foster Robinson in tow, and he was a powerful Bristolian, hinting at the Lord Mayor coming along abroad as a patron. And the powers that be looked around and said, they probably didn't know too much about Mark's past. They may have done. But they turned around and they said, you better do something academic. We can't have you just swanning around the world taking photographs and films. You've got to do some serious study. So Peter Crinks, the geographer who came in, he worked on a study area in India and one in South America. The Indian one he was dealing with through a social and economic institute in Pune in India. It was called the Gokhale Institute. And in South America, we were dealing with the United Nations project and Bolivian government project in the Andes and in the lowlands of Bolivia. So that satisfied the need for an academic project. So we moved on, but it did mean that we had 2 months in India and 2 months in Bolivia, studying, filming. I had a contract with the local TV company in those days. And Malcolm had a deal with the Western Daily Press, your big newspaper here. And the upshot of all this was that we had to cut down our time, that we really could not make the journey around the world on land, going across Australia and Central America and you name it. And so we found a liner, not a cruise ship, but in those days there were liners, passenger ships that travelled the world taking people to places. And Malcolm flew to Rotterdam and made a deal with the Royal Rotterdam Lloyd. They had a ship called the Willem Royce. And if I had time, I'd tell you that's another half-hour story, but the Willem Royce was a fantastic ship, had a fantastic history. If you've got your smartphones, look it up. We got a deal which took us from southern India right the way around to the west coast of South America, to a port called Callao, which is the port for the Peruvian capital, Lima. We had another newsletter published. This time we had a seventh member included, a guy called Rod Taylor, who was a captain of rugby for the university. I'm afraid I'm not going to explain why he didn't come. He can tell you he's here tonight. First time I've seen him for 57 years. So we published another newsletter outlining the project, outlining our route, and whipping up enthusiasm. And the money started to roll in. Literally, it rolled in. Oh, it was the first time on the newsletter that we had the University of Bristol Expedition Society mentioned. Rod is actually in this picture on the left at the back. Sponsors. 172, 175, it didn't make that much difference once we got to a certain level. For example, they gave one lot, gave us a beautiful set of watches, self-winders. This one is Mark Howell's, the only one I know that is surviving, and it still keeps reasonable time, gains about a minute a day, after a lot of exploring. Don was the doctor. He came in with a grant from the Medical Research Council to do medical studies in India and Bolivia. Mark was the sound recordist. He set up with the best we could do in those days, which was a huge reel-to-reel ferrograph recorder, which is on the back of a car, and a little one called a Ficord, which used tiny reels of tape about this size, and that came from Switzerland, battery-powered. You think what you're using today and what I've got stuffed in my pocket from Sam at the back. A Bristol company backed our cars with wire gauze, so it was done underneath the canvas to protect them from being pilfered. Marshes, I don't know whether they still exist, but they were the university outfitters up the road in Whiteladies Road, just beyond the, is it the Everyman Cinema up there on the left? And they gave us right royal kit of blazers and flannels and university badges. My university badge is on this table here. Please don't nick it. Outside the Vic rooms we had PR, and it was endless. Malden's jackets, beautiful sheepskin jackets from a firm in Glastonbury. Oh yes, I'm being reminded by my wife Marion that Roger, who's on the left, is wearing our kind of standard kit, which was commando stuff or from the Desert Rats, ex-army stuff from Millets, which was going, they just let us into their warehouse and gave us a discount on everything from beds to blankets to mosquito nets. You know, it was a feast of old ex-army rubbish. We got a second car. We had to pay a bit for it, but it came from the local Henrys of Bristol. I don't know whether they've survived the recessions that have been around. And we did a test run in the Mendips. And of course the hype comes along because we got stuck for about 5 hours. And of course the pundits were saying, if these young kids can't get across the Mendips, how are they going to get around the world? Well, we did it. I can't explain too much because it would take too long, but one of Malcolm's classic stories, the Western Daily Press, it's on our website now, and I think it's worth reading. It was a more philosophical piece, more thinking piece of why we would be making the expedition, what we expected to find, how we expected to be treated or whatever. It was looking into the project as a whole, and that is still there, and it take you about half an hour, if that, to read it. Then on came the mayor and gave us a civic send-off. We had our 2 cars standing in state outside the council house down here, and we had a cocktail party. The VC came along, and somebody nicked the VC's drink. I don't think he was too pleased about that. Friends, family and press turned up, and I put Roger in here because although I was supposed to be the photographer and filmmaker, my eyes were set upon recording much more in the 2 project areas and doing it as professionally as I could. Roger had, by great forethought, had got himself a small home movie camera, a little Bolex about this size. And he got several rolls of film, not enough to record every moment, but he did make a collection of pictures or films of our journey around the world. Here is the journey to India. The VC looks a bit unhappy on the left of the green. The Lord Mayor was very chatty. He was giving us 27 letters to distribute or take to mayors around the world. We had the full support of the city. This, you have to remember, is 57 years old, off a tiny, tiny camera, handheld, no stabilizers in that. So this is in eastern Turkey, somewhere around the base of Mount Ararat. Where's Val? He's the eastern Turkey Armenia expert. Just showing you how we were doing it. And the roads, they were, well, appalling. They were dirt and they were rotted. And you couldn't ride much more than 40 miles an hour before you got a real bounce into the car, and you had to go through a sound barrier at about 60 before you could really start driving. Hard going, you can see that. They had a very special form of suspension. It was, in those days, it was called a torsion bar suspension. It was not working on springs, it was working on rubber. And it really didn't work. This is the old Silk Road, you know, the way they came 2,000 years ago from Central Asia, and probably even brought the university flour, the nonsuch, from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, Iran. An old mosque and a caravanserai, which was one of the places where the camel caravans used to stop. And we had to tow for 150 miles. A stone nipped up, caught between the fan and the radiator and scoured it. So we towed. We arrived in Afghanistan rather apprehensive, not in the way we would be today, but it was tribal, and very few people had really gone through there by car. Absolutely no problem, very friendly. Many of them did have guns, old British, ex-army British guns. 303s we used to call them, made by a firm called Lee Enfield. professionals would call that a bit of hose piping, but it is Roger. And then to mark under the car, which was, I wouldn't say a daily occurrence, but was not far off it. Don, the doctor, was a specialist at cooking. He was appointed. You understand about nutrition, mate, you get on with the cooking. So he went in and bought veg in the local market, and we had tinned meat which we used on the way. This is approaching Kandahar, where 2 or 3 years ago, I don't know what it's like now, but there was fierce fighting around this area. Lovely, lovely scenery, and actually a beautiful atmosphere amongst the people, something that was pretty untouched in those days. I think they're a treasure. I'm quite looking forward to giving it to the university. Not the actual film, that's not going. They're getting a digital copy, as you can guess. This is the lower end of the Khyber Pass, from between, well, this is on the Pakistani side. We have a beggar or holy man coming up in a moment alongside the road. Then down the hill towards Lahore. Lahore had just, until that time, was the capital of Pakistan. Soon after we were there, it changed, or just before we were there, it had changed to Islamabad. But the signs are still in English, because we had really only been out of the place for 12 years. The High Commissioner, top honcho of the British kind of presence there at that time, he was there to welcome us. And believe it or not, I can't get into that kit now, but that's me walking around the Golden Temple of the Sikhs in Amritsar when we got to India. And then from Amritsar, it was on to the last of our sightseeing, as you might call it. Good time with the Sikhs, they were very hospitable. I think Roger was taken by the architecture. I kept that piece in. And the marigolds for garlands. Here's Raj with his garland and Peter. As you can see, it was pretty empty. But they were waiting for us. So where were we going? It's a bit of a scrubby Google Earth map. But Bombay, or Mumbai as we call it now, it was top left, Pune, and down here were the 3 villages that we're heading for. Koregaon, Puzigaon, and Aund, which was one of the finest little villages there because it was once the capital of a princely state, one of the old parts of old India. These are the Western Ghats, the mountains that flank the the Indian Ocean. And the Deccan itself is very dry. Rainfall is limited to a couple of months a year. And there's just one road. Or there was. This was Aund with its temple. We were based here for a month, but also we spent time in Corrigal. This is Aund. This is Corrigal, with a far better school, far better building. It was nearer to the roadhead, or railhead, I should say. They put on school shows for us. But Postgraduate was much more run down, poverty-stricken. But we had lots of hospitality and many, many meetings to talk about their agriculture and social affairs and how things worked. I had lots and lots of friends. I went on to make a short, a half-hour film there for the local TV company. There's no way on here. We arrived, it was in our two vehicles, they were expecting us. There's a bridge coming up in a moment, it may have come up already, but do watch out for it. You'll see it again later. And by the way, I wouldn't have this sound now because to me it had been lost. But a friend here in the audience, Keith Rogerson, very experienced sound recordist, pulled it off the tape for me just in time. This was the beginning of the final story tonight, but I'm not going to go into that at this moment. But we were surrounded by people from the village almost daily, looking at our vehicles and talking to us, wanting to know about our life, about the expedition. But my interest was in the folklore or folk work. And many of the things that I filmed, and some of which Roger filmed, have long since gone. Peter was taking notes all the time. These were the very poor people. And if you don't know much about India, in those days there was and still is, a stratification, social stratification, known as the caste system. And these were at the very lowest end of the caste. This is a simple way of grinding a sickle. You use the rope to spin a drum, and that in turn is used with the stone. This was threshing. It still goes on in some parts of India, although more modern technology is around. But this is threshing a form of millet. The oxen go around and crush the stuff, then the chaff is taken away, and then wind is used to separate the final grains. This is cow dung. I think it's called goba, and it's sacred. It was used, and I think still is used in some places, for their walls and for the floor. And even our bungalows had cow dung, dry cow dung on the floor, and we'd sit on that and eat. The potter used dried dung in his black pottery. He became a good friend, and I still have a few pieces of his black pottery in my small collection at home. That, I can tell you, doesn't happen in Postgraduate anymore, or not as far as I know. I think you have to realise too that this was 57 years ago for British TV, when the world had not really been seen. I think David Attenborough had just about got going. And this is putting a steel rim or an iron rim on a wooden cartwheel. You heat the iron, drop it over the wood, and then cool it down with water. And it shrinks, obviously with contraction. It tightens the whole thing. Right, okay. From Postgraduate, we had to go down very quickly to make a date, or the date had been made with our liner to take us around the world, or half the world. It was a hell of a drive, I can assure you, and we had to cross a small strait between India and what was then Ceylon, but now Sri Lanka. We crossed that in the middle of close to a typhoon. One thing I could say is that we were short of time, and so Don Pilton, our doctor, had a supply of amphetamines. Now, I don't really know about amphetamines, but in those days, amphetamines were used by students to keep themselves awake during exams or in the run-up to exams. But in our case, we had a small supply which was for emergency use when we had to drive late or through the night or for 2 days at a time. And Don broke open the amphetamines, and I didn't try them, but Malcolm did. And Malcolm, being rather histrionic, I'm afraid he's not with us tonight, but he drove, and I would like to say like a bat out of hell. We drove absolutely non-stop from the point of landing to Colombo. It was a hairy drive. With palm trees were down all over the roads. We had to get ourselves through this lot. There are just a few clips of the drive that Roger took, and I haven't got those with me tonight. But it was we made it. Anyway, we got to the boat on time. 4 stops: Melbourne, Sydney, well, Singapore, Melbourne, Sydney, and Wellington, New Zealand. Middle of the Pacific, with the captain, I think it was Captain Van der Herville, I think his name was. And then to Peru, where we landed our gypsies. And this is a very simple map. You've got Lima up there, where we started. We were coming down south towards this place called Arica, but we're then going to turn up into Bolivia, over the mountains, past this lake called Lake Titicaca, which I'm sure some of your budding expeditions will have heard about. And we're off to have a look at some United Nations bases. This was going down the Peruvian coast, and over the mountains where we got very much stuck. Rainy season, and then into the lovely, absolutely unforgettable blue skies of the high Andes. But the peak there is close on, I think might even be a 6,000 metre one. Into the middle. And from experience, which I'm sure you'll read about on non-such expeditions, I can say that much of that music has gone. So have the instruments and the styles. So Mark was making a set of recordings, which I'll go into later in questions, but it was music which has disappeared. We were there a few years after the National Revolution. Now, until 1952, the whole of the country was really controlled by a few families and also the three big mining companies. Amazingly, the wealthy families that ran the place with the military and the church or whatever, they were known as the La Rosca, the screw. I think that's right, isn't it? And the land was taken back by the government. The mines were expropriated and turned into nationalised mines. And we were there to really make a record of what the effects were after this big takeover. We were dealing with the International Labour Organization and the UN and the Bolivian government. So it had some power behind it. We were going to 4 different bases. We were going to Pillapi up on the lake, Titicaca, Playa Verde down here, one called Otavi down there, and another one called Cotoca out there. I'll show you just a few pictures as we go along. Did I hear the geek? Yeah, that's great, George. He's still chiming me. I must tell Mark about that. Lake Titicaca, we were based near this famous lake. It was fascinating, particularly as a photographer. But we were based in an old Bolivian Spanish hacienda or farmhouse or farm estate house. And we were lucky because we could sit down in a little patio writing things here. We had occasional visits from the person who was United Nations rep, as they called it in those days. She turned out later on to move on to become the Under-Secretary General of the UN. And the whole thing was run by the Bolivian government. They called it the Misión Andina. And unfortunately, can we go back a bit? Etched on my mind and that of my wife, Marion, is that door there. It led to the most disgusting set of toilets, loos, bogs, whatever you like to call them, that you could ever imagine. The walls were covered with excrement. I can't go any further, I'm being told to shut up. But my wife, or Marion, was there 2 years later doing a graduate project, also with the UN. And it just so happened that we both visited the same spot. I'd left my mark. The teaching was supposed to extend to the people, the indigenous people of the area, and they were being taught to write, to be hygienic, to take modern medicines, to understand cars and things like that. Television wasn't even on the cards. Nearby was the famous, it is now, famous archaeological site of Tiwanaku, about 800 years of history. Then we went off to another base where they were sitting on a pile of cassiterite tin ore, and there's the miners, their story, the expropriation of the mines, the poverty in the village nearby, although They were getting help. But here they are, the poor people sifting through the tailings of the tin to take out as little ore as they can. Much the same as Welsh people used to do in the valleys here, where they go up on the spoil tips and search for coal. Then we went to a warmer place called Otavi, different group of indigenous people. They used to be called Indians, they're now given their name by their language. This was a Quechua village. And they were enjoying agriculture. They were putting here beans winnowing in the wind, but there was poverty as well. Our doctor took many people into his hospital. He gave them drugs, looked after them for our short stay. Peter Crinks made friends with the Frenchman, who was the local rep or assistant or to the UN, and they got on famously, and they made many records. But the fourth place was a place called Kotoka, and that is, I'm putting that in special place tonight because it's an area that over the 40 years or more that I've known, 50 years of knowing South America and particularly Bolivia, has fascinated me enormously. Kotoka is in the lowlands. If you look here, to start with, we've been up in these highlands around the lake. You can see a little boat floating there. Halfway down is another city called Cochabamba. And down here, you're right on the edge of the Amazon basin. The rivers are flowing towards the Amazon itself, or southwards towards the Great River Plate. And the plot at that time was to try and get people who would like to, they didn't force them, but they suggested that they might find a better life cutting down forest in the lowlands. And as they were cutting down the forest, they could plant any crop they wanted to. So just beyond that mountain, it drops down straight from here. The road goes down just like a helter-skelter. And I made a short film.
Adentro mi alma, un puñal envenenado y atravesaste el río. Honda huellas ha dejado en mi corazón deshecho de amor. Honda huellas ha dejado.
11.5 hours to do 25 kilometers.
Some experts believe that the best answer for Bolivia is to move people down to the underpopulated lowlands. This is a government colonization center to the east of the Andes, altitude 1,500 feet. There are brick houses with gardens and many flowers, for the climate is tropical. There is plenty of land once it is reclaimed from the forest, and it is very fertile. Cotton, corn, sugarcane, citrus and soft fruits grow easily. Enough food for the whole country could be produced once the problem of communications across the Andes was solved. In this colony there is water from a tap instead of from a stagnant pool, and communal washing facilities. The hospital. Insects and snakes are unknown on the Altiplano.
All this was new building.
People must now get accustomed to them.
We did a lot of talking. I was fascinated, and I went back many times over the next 40 years and watched the changes. People went down, they cut down the forest, they built their own little homes, they grew new crops. Sugar cane is growing on right now.
These are the petroleum companies. Centro Comercial Petrolero.
taken
And
with
this here where they're
a
living
friend
now
who've known for many
used
years.
to be a nice supermercado, but one time on Christmas someone lighted a cigarette and burned the whole thing here. So they're reconstructing. I was in Chile at that time. This is a nice hotel, Caparouche, with nice shops, but expensive ones. You want to go to Los Tejibos?
Google Earth again, I'm afraid.
Adentro mi alma, un puñal envenenado y atravesaste el mundo. Honda huellas ha dejado en mi corazón deshecho de
Just
amor.
thousands and thousands of fields, many of them producing soya or soja.
Deshecho de amor. Al cielo pido la muerte.
Okay, right, well I can see the time is zipping along, but I'm going to give you the last 5 minutes. Our last project was especially for the city of Bristol, with those letters I was talking about. We were heading north to start talking to people in different towns and cities in Bristol, in the States, where the name of Bristol meant something. And we had to deliver letters to the mayors, which was very helpful because it meant drinks and food and camping spots and so on. So we raced north to the Caribbean coast, and because our ship was late, we decided to take a quick flight, which Roger Tutt had managed to negotiate. And we loaded our cars onto this old C-46 in Colombia and took off, skimming the palm trees at the end of the runway, over towards Miami, over the Florida Keys, and then landed at Miami Airport, where we were met by the customs and agriculture, who said, we need to wash under the cars. Okay, very expensive. I see a note in someone's notes that I've got in front of me that it was an expensive operation. Had to be America. You don't get that kind of notice anywhere but America. And then the first flip. Malcolm doesn't know how it happened, but they went over on their side quite gracefully and comfortably. And 2 minutes to pick it up. We were on our way again, and in Oklahoma, the highway patrol stopped us and said, hey, what are you guys up to? You know, British flags and cars with a drive on the wrong side. So we chatted for about a quarter of an hour, and they let us on. Chicago charged us £2 to park a car, which was something we had never even thought of. We got loads and loads of press. We had friends from Canadians who'd been at university here. We met the mayor of Bristol in Toronto and his good wife. We met the lady president of the union, who was also by then doing a social job in Windsor, Ontario. The VC had been there and put a plaque up, not for us, but for himself in Bristol, 2 years before we got there. We signed a book in Kitchener, and Roger was kind of quietly smoking a fag in the background. Gwen is having shutters in the front. Stratford, we attended Henry VIII at the new theatre in Stratford, Ontario. Sad thing that planes in those days did come down quite a lot, but that was in Bristol, Connecticut. And then I had to put this one in because where else do you kind of get kudos apart from a shot kind of driving down Main Avenue in New York? Over the bridge of the Potomac, and and a bit of privileged parking outside the Capitol. I don't think the press was there. And then we loaded in Baltimore, and we came home, sun setting slowly in the west, as they say, but we came home to a civic reception in Avonmouth. lots of shaking of hands, and we had the cars unloaded. We actually had a golden key on board that we were supposed to be giving to the mayor, but it was deep in the cargo. And we had drinks, and then drove along the portway back to the Vic Rooms. And we got into the Vic Rooms, which was then the Union Centre. We stopped into the bar. Beer. Phew, it's over. We'd been there about 2 or 3 minutes at the door, and a guy came in and said, "You're the man who landed earlier today?" We said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'm from the customs." because we'd been seen through by the mayor, they didn't. No one, even the police outriders, didn't bother us. But the customs realised that we hadn't actually signed the right chitties. So we did there and then, and gave him a pint, and he did the proverbial. And now I'd like to tell you, that's the credit line. We produced a general report, and there will be copies of it somewhere. And I'd like to thank, obviously, the entire committee of the UBES, or UBES as you call it. Great evening, and thank you very much. But before I finish, I haven't quite got there, because in 2000, the year 2000, I was sitting in my little study down in Suffolk, and I'm surrounded by books and junk, and I don't know what I was doing at the time. Anyway, the phone goes, and it's the university, and called Miles Stevenson, and he said, "Are you Tony Morrison?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you the Tony Morrison who was on the university expedition?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I've got a letter here from the Chief of Police in Bombay." Yeah, quite. Parking tickets. What else have been up to in Bombay? He said, "There's a man there, Chief of Police, would like to get in touch with you because you were in the village where he was born or brought up in, Puzigain or whatever you call it. And he'd like to get in touch with you to see whether there are any reports or records of your journey." So I corresponded with a man who came to know, we knew then as DN, Dhananjay Jadhav. And over about 9 months, I sent out stuff, videos, papers, and reports. And then in came what was wonderful. Would we like to go back to the village and see them and enjoy seeing how Puzigaon was then in 2000? Unfortunately, only 3 of us could go. I was still fairly fit. We had Roger, our young business manager, who sadly is not with us anymore, and we had Peter Crinks. Peter, by that time, had become a prof in Macquarie University in Australia. So we all arranged to meet, together with our wives, in Bombay, or Mumbai, as by then it was known, and we were met at the airport in a right royal way, massive Tata Mercedes people carrier, flowers and garlands, and we were whisked off into the Highlands up that road into the Ghats. And Roger, together with the local television, Maharashtra Television and Recording, they made a record, runs for about 7 hours. So to save you missing closing time, I cut it down to 3 minutes, and I'd like to I'd like to show you 3 minutes of our return to Puzigaon. We met Dhananjay Jadhav and his wife and family. And we thought it was going to be a fairly family affair. I said, remember that bridge, which was empty. We had to give speeches. This is Dhananjay giving speeches. Gwen and Peter Crink's wife, Peter. By that time, we were being put into turbans, different to Maison Millet. I could find the sound somewhere, but it was deep in. This is Roger.
Congratulations, you are a wonderful community and a wonderful school.
The second day of our visit dawned beautifully, and we were off to the villages of Corrigan and Ound, where we had lived in the government rest houses in 1960. Later that evening, we were to enjoy a very special party at the home of Dhananjay and Sheila Jadhav, with Vera, Marion and Gwen generously provided with new saris for the occasion.
Actually, it was fantastic grub. Really.
We marvelled at how such a delicious meal could be served to so many people with such great efficiency.
He was the priest from the temple.
Turbans, and with the splendid saris in evidence, we were to be bidden farewell. as we all finally stood for the Indian national anthem, our sense of gratitude to our hosts and to the village for our being at the centre of all this was, of course, just immense.
It was quite an adventure, I can assure you. Well, we arrived, we had a boat fixed, or a ship fixed, to take us from the north coast of Colombia through to somewhere in Central America, and probably Nicaragua. And when we arrived in Barranquilla, the port, we were told the ship was going to be at least 6 weeks late. So I can see gasps going around here. What do? There are words you can say. So we were stuck. But Roger, who had already kind of showed his mettle in changing money in the bazaars of Afghanistan and Kabul and places like that, and as a young 21-year-old he was on the way up to something, probably no good. But anyway, he was in a bar. He was not one of those characters who normally was hanging around bars, but he met someone I just call Capitan Lopez. And Capitan Lopez said, "Say, señor, no hay problema. I'm going to Miami tomorrow to pick up an aero engine which is being repaired." That's how they did it in those days. They shipped them around. He said, "I'm going out empty. If you'd like to pay me the fuel," which is about $250, which is quite a lot of cash in those days, he said, "I can take you. No problem." So we arrived at the airport just after dawn, shoved the things on board. When we got trying to get them to the top of that thing, our cars were very heavy, we couldn't drive them into the plane. So our doctor, being very inventive, said, "Let's shove some oil under the tires and push them in." So we had Castrol cans of oil, and we threw that around on the steel top of this thing, and hey presto, we all shoved, and the cars went in, and up with the next one, slid it in, and in a few minutes, we were off. Cuba, I think we covered in, I don't know, probably 1,000 feet, just staggering along. Clear sky in one place, cloudy in another, and then to Miami.
Getting off the ground, though, didn't you?
Oh yeah, well it was very hard getting off the ground. I didn't want to over dramatize it. I mean, we all put our arms out on one side and flapped, but literally went along the runway and the palm trees at the end, and we were clipping the palm trees as we went off. The plane was definitely overloaded, but we did it, thankfully. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Yeah. I hope that answers that question, but there are plenty more, I'm sure. If there aren't, I'll go home or go and have a beer. One was returned to Austin Motors, complete with, it will be digitized, complete with the list of problems. I think the thing went out of production after a couple of years. But Mark was very meticulous and made a fine record of mileage, petrol usage, and the repairs. We had spares flown out to us or sent out by sea in many places there was a network of Austrian dealers. So they got a car back, but it was pretty rubbishy. The other one was sold here in Bristol and probably is knocking around somewhere in a collection. Oh, well, you want to know the amount? He came up, we had a budget of 10 grand, which is today about 200,000. And he came up with 1 grand, which is roughly 20,000. And he said, put my name at the top of a list. We were a bit dejected by the idea. He said, put my name at the top of a list and take it around to all the wealthy people in Bristol and see what you can get. It worked. Yes, of course, obviously in India, many of the people were learning English. It was part of in those days, it was part of the school curriculum. Many of the people that were there, the older people, had lived in the days of the British Raj, when the British government ran the show. The kids were all wanting to learn English. We got many recordings of them trying to learn English, and we got by. In other places, it was up to Peter Krinks, our geographer, who'd done a Russian course for his national service and could get by in about half a dozen languages, even as we travelled through the Middle East. By the time we got to Spain, to South America, we were all learning Spanish, at least enough to kind of buy a cup of coffee. And then we moved on from there. And the people in the international organizations, they spoke a variety of languages, English and Spanish and French and German and so on. So between us, we got quite a lot out of it, yeah. They were written on a typewriter. I don't know whether you know what a typewriter looks like. And they were written on a flimsy paper which was called airmail paper. And they were put in an envelope together with 2 or 3 negatives that it was all on film, so it all had to be developed on the way. So these negatives were then sent back here to Bristol. And we had one very good contact, his name was Bert Connell, who was a PhD microbiologist, and he sorted the stuff out together with one of our senior members, who was a Home Office pathologist, Bill Hunt, and they would get these through to the Western Daily Press and make sure that the pictures came back. Once the authorities in this great building decided that they needed to look after us, because we were like loose cannons, they insisted that we had a number of senior members on the committee. And one of those was Alan Rogers, who'd been the doctor on a British Trans-Antarctic Expedition. And he took over the show and said, you need the following, including loads and loads of dental work, and we had something like 2.5 months of injections and dental treatment before leaving.
The treatment was by the students?
Oh, it was all done by the students, yes. A very senior student in the dental school took out my wisdom teeth, two on one occasion, 2 weeks later. I loved her very much. The answer to that is once. We arrived in India, and both Roger and I found we had some form of fever, and it really threw our doctor into, he just didn't know. Gave us a kind of a universal antibiotic at the time, and we went onto our camp beds and stayed there for about 7 days. Literally just drinking sips of water, boiled water, and temperature rising to about, in in Fahrenheit days, it was about 102, 103. And he was obviously very worried, but I don't know whether he called on other people to examine us because there was no one there. In fact, he was in charge of looking after the Raja, the princely state of Ound. So you can kind of see the distance and the problem. But fortunately, we got better. Apart from that, we had the inevitable kind of runny tummies, or whatever you like to call it these days. We call it squits, which it did, that kind of noise. So that was fine. The story might be in the memoirs, and they're going to be published by Sue Grabbit and Run. I know it's Snipcock and Tweed, I think it is, publish such stuff for the Private Eye. No, I'm not going to go into. I'm not going into any details. We've got all sorts of card machines outside.
So Mark was involved.
Mark was involved, yes. Mark. Sorry, Sally, what was that?
I think you remember Mark telling me, but
No, I think, yeah. All I can really tell you, and it's, as Mark is not here, but his wife is, he fashioned a skeleton key to the tower, which was quite a feat. And I don't know where that key is now. I mean, if I did, I'd put it on the market for a good price. But that was the key to the story. So thank you very much indeed. Great pleasure. Anything ever you want to know about expeditioning that you think I might be able to help with, just get in touch with me through the committee in some way. Okay?